When loyal employee Liam refuses to falsify records for his corrupt boss, Rick Whitaker, his life is turned upside down. Fired, blacklisted, and robbed of his severance, Liam struggles to support his family while battling the shame of being cast aside. But when he uncovers a pattern of wage theft, safety violations, and fraud at Rick's company, Liam decides to fight back. Teaming up with a whistleblowing employee, a disgruntled accountant, and an investigative journalist, Liam builds an airtight case that not only destroys Rick's career but also exposes a web of corruption far larger than anyone imagined. As lawsuits, media scandals, and federal investigations pile up, Rick's once mighty empire crumbles. But just as Liam begins to move on, he discovers Rick was just a cog in a larger conspiracy involving powerful figures desperate to remain hidden. With lives on the line and threats closing in, Liam must decide how far he's willing to go to bring the truth to light. What starts as a battle for justice spirals into a high-stakes war against untouchable elites in this gripping tale of revenge, corruption, and unexpected heroism. It all started with a single decision. I had worked at Prime Haulage for over 7 years, steadily climbing the ranks from an entry-level logistics coordinator to a manager overseeing operations. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid well, and for a while, I thought I had job security. At least, until the day Rick the Snake made his move. Rick, short for Richard Whitaker, owned the company. He wasn't the kind of boss who cared about his employees. Rick was a shark, always out for himself. He drove a flashy car, wore custom suits, and bragged about his latest business deals like he was some kind of corporate god. But behind closed doors, Rick was a con artist. He cut every corner possible and exploited anyone he could to pad his profits. For years, I looked the other way, telling myself I wasn't the one making the decisions. That is, until the day he asked me to do something I couldn't stomach. It was a Tuesday morning, and I had just sat down with my coffee when Rick summoned me to his office. His assistant, Carla, gave me a pitying look as she buzzed me in. Rick was sitting behind his oversized mahogany desk, flipping through papers like he didn't have a care in the world. He didn't even look up as I walked in. "Liam, we've got a problem," he said, tapping his pen against a document. "This shipment from overseas came in overweight, and the customs fees are through the roof. I need you to adjust the paperwork. Bring the declared weight down, shave off a few £1,000s, and save us the headache." I froze, unsure if I had heard him right. "You want me to falsify customs documents?" Rick finally looked up, a sly grin spreading across his face. "It's not falsifying. It's creative problem solving. Trust me, it's how things get done in this business." I could feel my stomach turn. Sure, I'd seen Rick bend the rules before, cutting hours for employees to save on overtime, ignoring maintenance reports on broken equipment, but this? This was straight up illegal. If we got caught, I'd be the one left holding the bag. "I can't do that," I said, my voice firm. "It's fraud." Rick leaned back in his chair, his grin vanishing. "Liam, you've been here long enough to know how this works. We're not running a charity. We're running a business. If you're not willing to do what needs to be done, maybe this isn't the right fit for you." I felt a cold wave wash over me. He wasn't asking, he was threatening. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I shook my head. "I'm sorry, Rick. I won't do it." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might explode. Instead, he gave me a chilling smile and waved me off. "Fine. Get out." I walked out of that office knowing I had just made an enemy of the most dangerous man in the company. For the next few weeks, things went downhill fast. Rick began micromanaging me, questioning every decision I made. He sent me impossible tasks, then berated me when I couldn't deliver. Rumors started circulating about my incompetence, and employees I'd worked with for years began avoiding me. I knew Rick was orchestrating it all, but I had no way to prove it. The final blow came on a Friday afternoon. I was called into HR for what I thought was a routine meeting. Instead, I was handed a termination letter. The reason? Poor performance and failure to align with company values. I couldn't believe it. After everything I'd done for the company, after years of loyalty, Rick had thrown me out like yesterday's trash. To make matters worse, they refused to pay me my severance, claiming I had violated policy by not following orders. It was all a lie, but Rick had made sure to cover his tracks. When I walked out of the building that day, box of belongings in hand, I felt like a failure. How was I going to tell Emily, my wife? We had a mortgage, bills, and plans for the future. Now, all of it was at risk because of Rick's petty revenge. That evening, I sat across from Emily at the kitchen table, struggling to get the words out. She listened quietly as I explained everything: Rick's demand, my refusal, the smear campaign, and the firing. When I was done, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice steady. "You did the right thing, Liam. We'll get through this." Her support kept me going, but as the weeks passed, the weight of unemployment grew heavier. The logistics industry wasn't kind to people like me. Word got around fast, and it didn't take long for Rick's version of the story to reach potential employers. Every interview ended the same way: polite smiles and a rejection email. Our savings drained quicker than I expected. Emily picked up extra shifts at the hospital, but it still wasn't enough to cover everything. I hated watching her work herself to the bone while I sat at home, sending out resumes that never got replies. The stress was eating me alive. I felt useless. Broken. Then, one night, everything changed. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through job boards for the 100th time, when I stumbled across a post on a legal advice forum. The title caught my eye: "Is it legal for my boss to make me work off the clock?" Curious, I clicked on it. The post was from an anonymous employee complaining about being forced to clock out early but stay and finish their shift. As I read through the comments, I realized this wasn't an isolated incident. Dozens of people chimed in with similar stories, and some even mentioned Rick's name. I felt a spark of anger ignite in my chest. This wasn't just about me anymore. Rick wasn't just a bad boss, he was a predator. He was exploiting his workers, breaking laws, and ruining lives, all while living like a king. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. He had destroyed my career, humiliated me, and put my family in financial jeopardy. And for what? So he could keep cutting corners. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to sit back and let Rick get away with it. If he thought he could crush me and move on like nothing happened, he was dead wrong. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to make him pay. I reached out to the anonymous poster, sending them a private message. "Hey," I wrote, "I used to work at Prime College. I know what you're going through. I want to help." To my surprise, they responded almost immediately. The poster was a warehouse worker named Mike. Over the next few days, we exchanged messages, and he told me everything. Rick had been forcing employees to work unpaid overtime for years. If anyone complained, they were either fired or silenced with threats. Safety protocols were ignored, and injuries were swept under the rug. It was worse than I had imagined. Mike was hesitant to share too much at first. He had a family to think about and couldn't afford to lose his job. But when I told him my story, about how Rick had ruined my career, he started to open up. Slowly, we began to piece together a plan. The first step was gathering evidence. Mike agreed to keep a log of everything that happened at the warehouse: unpaid hours, safety violations, anything he could document. Meanwhile, I started digging through my own records. I had saved copies of old emails and texts from Rick, including the ones where he had pressured me to break the law. I compiled everything into a folder on my computer, labeling it "The Snake's Venom." But I knew it wasn't enough. If I wanted to bring Rick down, I needed more people on my side. So, I reached out to other former employees, people I knew had left under suspicious circumstances. At first, most of them were reluctant to talk, scared of the legal repercussions. But as word spread, more and more people came forward. Each story was worse than the last. Together, we began building a case so strong that not even Rick's army of lawyers could tear it apart. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. Rick had spent years destroying lives, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. This was just the beginning. I wasn't naive, I knew taking Rick down wouldn't be easy. This wasn't just about exposing one corrupt man. Rick had spent years building a fortress around himself, from ironclad legal contracts to loyal executives who'd do anything to keep their cushy positions. He thought he was untouchable. That's what made this fight worth it. With Mike keeping tabs on what was happening inside the warehouse and former employees feeding me their stories, the picture of Rick's corruption grew clearer every day. But even with everything we were gathering, I knew I needed help, someone who understood how to turn our evidence into action. That's when I thought of Carly. Carly was an old college friend who had built a career as an investigative journalist. She'd always been a dog with a bone when it came to exposing injustice, and I knew if anyone could see through Rick's lies, it was her. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but desperation makes you reach out to people you'd otherwise hesitate to contact. "Carly, it's Liam," I said when she picked up. "I need your help." At first, she didn't recognize my voice. But as soon as I started explaining the situation, she perked up. "Wait. Rick Whitaker. Prime haulage. Are you telling me that guy is as dirty as I always suspected?" "Worse," I said, recounting the unpaid wages, safety violations, and tax fraud we'd uncovered so far. Carly was quiet for a moment, then I heard her take a deep breath. "Send me everything you've got," she said. "If it checks out, I'll look into it." That night, I emailed her the initial file I'd put together, emails, text messages, and sworn statements from former employees. Carly called me back 2 days later. "Liam, this is explosive," she said. "But I'll be honest, it's not enough to nail him. You've got documentation, sure, but for something this big, I need hard proof. Financial records, recorded conversations, video evidence, stuff no one can argue with. Do you think you can get that?" It was a tall order, but I didn't hesitate. "I'll find a way." My first step was reaching out to Mike. If anyone could help us get inside Prime haulage, it was him. Mike was nervous, he had 2 kids to feed, and risking his job could put everything on the line. But when I told him Carly was on board, he agreed to help. "I can't promise anything," he said over the phone, "but I'll see what I can do." The next few weeks were a blur. Mike started documenting everything that happened at the warehouse. He secretly recorded conversations with his supervisors, who casually mentioned how Rick's orders often involved bending the rules. He took photos of broken equipment left unrepaired, even after injuries had occurred. And when payday came, he made copies of his pay stubs, showing the discrepancies between his actual hours and what he was being paid for. Meanwhile, I was working on another angle, Rick's finances. I knew he'd been cooking the books for years, but I needed proof. That's when I remembered something from my time as a manager. Rick had an accountant named Steven, a nervous guy who always looked like he was one coffee away from a breakdown. I figured if anyone knew where the skeletons were buried, it was him. Getting Steven to talk wasn't easy. At first, he ignored my calls and emails. But I was persistent, and eventually, he agreed to meet me at a coffee shop far away from the Prime haulage offices. Steven looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hands shook as he stirred his coffee, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected Rick to walk in at any moment. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want the truth," I said. "You and I both know Rick's been breaking the law. Help me prove it." Steven laughed bitterly. "You think I don't know that? He's been using me as his scapegoat for years. If this all comes crashing down, I'm the one who's going to prison, not him." "Then why are you still working for him?" I asked. "Because I don't have a choice," he said, his voice cracking. "I've got a family, a mortgage. If I lose this job, I lose everything." I leaned in closer. "Steven, he's going to take you down with him no matter what. You think Rick cares about you? The second he's cornered, he'll throw you under the bus without a second thought. But if you help me, I can protect you. I've got a journalist working on this. If we bring this to the authorities, you could get immunity." Steven hesitated, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "I don't know." "Think about your family," I said. "Do you want them to see you dragged away in handcuffs? Or do you want to be the guy who stood up and did the right thing? That seemed to hit a nerve. Stephen sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Okay, he said. I'll help you. But if this backfires, we're both screwed. With Stephen on board, the pieces started falling into place. He provided me with copies of financial records that showed just how deep Rick's fraud went. He had falsified tax documents, embezzled company funds, and even set up shell companies to hide his illicit profits. It was all there in black and white. While Stephen and Mike worked from the inside, I kept coordinating with Carly. She started connecting the dots, turning our raw evidence into a cohesive narrative. But we still needed one final piece, something that would shock people into action. That's when Mike came through with the smoking gun. One day, he called me, his voice shaking with excitement. Liam, you're not going to believe this. I found something huge. What is it? I asked, leaning forward in my chair. Rick's been using unregistered trucks to move shipments. They're unsafe, uninsured, and completely illegal. I've got video of them loading one up right now. I could barely contain my excitement. Send it to me, I said. When I saw the footage, my jaw dropped. The video showed workers loading heavy cargo onto a rusty, beat-up truck with no license plates. The kind of truck that looked like it could fall apart at any second. In the background, you could hear a supervisor barking orders, telling the workers to move faster, because Rick doesn't want this sitting around too long. This was it. The proof we needed. I sent everything to Carly, who immediately knew what to do with it. She contacted her editor and pitched the story. They agreed to run it as an exposé, complete with video evidence, financial records, and interviews from former employees. A week later, the story broke. The headline was brutal: CEO accused of fraud, exploitation, and unsafe practices, the dark truth behind prime haulage. It wasn't just a local story, it went national. News outlets picked it up, and within hours, Rick's name was everywhere. Reporters camped outside his mansion, demanding answers. Employees at Prime Haulage started walking out in protest. Clients began canceling contracts, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. But the best part? The authorities finally took notice. The Department of Labor launched an investigation into the wage theft allegations. OSHA showed up at the warehouse to inspect the safety violations. And the IRS began poring over Rick's financial records. He had spent years building his empire, but now it was crumbling around him. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Rick had thought he could destroy me and move on, but now the tables had turned. He wasn't untouchable anymore. And this was only the beginning of his downfall. Rick's downfall wasn't just a spectacle, it was a symphony of chaos, and every new development felt like a victory in the battle against a man who thought he was above the rules. The exposé Carly published had ignited a firestorm that Rick couldn't control. It wasn't just the news coverage that was destroying him, it was the ripple effect. Once one piece of his empire started to crack, the rest followed, and this time, there wasn't anywhere for him to hide. The day after Carly's article went live, Rick held a press conference outside the Prime Haulage headquarters. Dressed in a suit that looked a little less pristine than usual, he stood in front of a swarm of cameras with that same smug expression he always wore. But even through the TV screen, I could see the cracks. His tie was slightly askew, his smile strained. Rick Whittaker wasn't used to being on the defensive. These allegations are baseless, he said, his voice measured and rehearsed. Prime Haulage has always operated with integrity and in full compliance with the law. These are just the lies of disgruntled former employees trying to tarnish our reputation. We will be pursuing legal action to defend ourselves. I almost laughed. He sounded like a caricature of himself, throwing out empty words in the hopes they'd stick. But the reporters weren't buying it. They shouted over one another, bombarding him with questions about the evidence Carly had published. What about the video showing unregistered trucks? Can you explain the financial records showing embezzlement? Why are so many employees coming forward with identical claims of wage theft? Rick waved them off, muttering something about no further comment, and walked back into the building. But the damage was already done. This wasn't something he could spin. The world was starting to see him for who he really was. Meanwhile, things were moving quickly behind the scenes. The Department of Labor subpoenaed Prime Hollage's records, and OSHA shut down the warehouse operations after finding enough safety violations to make a lawyer drool. Employees were coming forward in droves now, emboldened by the media attention and the growing investigations. Mike told me morale inside the company had hit rock bottom. Everyone knew the ship was sinking. For Rick, it was more than just a PR disaster, it was financial Armageddon. Clients were pulling their contracts faster than he could respond. Without them, Prime Hollage couldn't sustain its operations. Within weeks, rumors started circulating that the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. And yet, Rick still hadn't been hit with the worst of it. That came when the IRS finally completed its preliminary investigation. I'll never forget the moment I saw the news alert on my phone: Prime Hollage CEO Rick Whitaker charged with tax fraud and embezzlement. I clicked on the article so fast, I almost dropped my phone. The IRS had found enough evidence to press criminal charges against Rick, including falsified tax documents, fraudulent shell companies, and millions of dollars in unreported income. For years, Rick had been funneling money into offshore accounts, thinking no one would ever catch on. But thanks to Stephen's courage in providing the financial records, he was now facing federal charges that could land him in prison for decades. The fallout hit fast and hard. Rick's lawyers released a statement claiming he was cooperating fully with the investigation, but that didn't stop the arrest warrant from being issued. 2 days later, I watched the news footage of Rick being led out of his mansion in handcuffs, his once pristine suit replaced by a rumpled polo shirt. His face was pale, his confidence gone. The man who had ruined my life and so many others finally looked small. I wish I could say I felt sorry for him, but I didn't. Not even a little. But even as Rick's world fell apart, mine wasn't magically fixed. Emily and I were still struggling to make ends meet, and the legal fight for my unpaid severance was dragging on. Rick might have been gone, but Prime Hollage was still a legal entity, and their lawyers were doing everything they could to delay the process. That's when Carly came through with another brilliant idea. "You've got enough evidence to file a class action lawsuit," she said during one of our calls. "If you can get enough of the employees Rick wronged to join, you'll have a much stronger case." And honestly, it's not just about the money. It's about sending a message. The idea terrified me at first. A class action lawsuit wasn't just a legal battle, it was a war. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Rick might have been arrested, but the people he'd hurt deserved justice too. And if I could lead that fight, maybe I could finally find some closure. I spent the next few weeks reaching out to the employees who had already spoken to me. Mike helped me organize meetings with the warehouse workers, many of whom were eager to join once they realized they weren't alone. Slowly but surely, the group grew, and with the help of a determined attorney Carly connected me with, we filed the suit. The media caught wind of it almost immediately. Carly made sure of that. Within days, headlines like "Former Employees Unite to Take Down Prime Hollage" and "Class Action Lawsuit Seeks Millions in Damages from Disgraced CEO" were everywhere. The public was eating it up, and for once, the narrative wasn't controlled by Rick or his team. It was a long, grueling process. Depositions, court dates, and countless legal hurdles drained what little energy I had left. But as each new piece of evidence was presented, I could feel the tide turning in our favor. The judge even commented on the overwhelming volume of evidence we had, calling it one of the most damning cases of corporate misconduct he'd ever seen. Then, after months of fighting, the verdict came. Prime Hollage was found liable for millions in unpaid wages, damages, and penalties. The class action suit was a victory, not just for me but for every employee Rick had exploited. The company was ordered to pay restitution, and while it didn't erase the years of suffering, it was a step toward healing. For me, the payout meant Emily and I could finally get back on track. We paid off the mortgage, cleared our debts, and even set aside some money for the future. But the real victory wasn't the money, it was knowing that Rick had finally been held accountable for his actions. As for Rick, his story didn't end with the arrest. The criminal charges against him led to a highly publicized trial, where he tried to play the victim. His lawyers argued that he was misunderstood, that his actions were misinterpreted. But the evidence was undeniable, and the jury saw through his lies. Rick was found guilty on multiple counts of tax fraud, embezzlement, and wage theft. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The last time I saw him was on the news, being led into the courthouse in an orange jumpsuit. The man who had once towered over everyone with his arrogance now looked like a shell of himself. It was poetic justice, and I couldn't help but smile. Life after Rick wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. I found a new job with a smaller logistics company that treated its employees with respect. Emily and I rebuilt what we'd lost, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Rick thought he could ruin me and move on like I didn't matter. But in the end, he underestimated just how far I was willing to go to make things right, not just for myself, but for everyone he'd hurt. Justice had been served, and for once, the good guys won. For a while, it felt like the story had wrapped up perfectly. Rick was in prison, Prime College was dismantled, and Emily and I were finally back on our feet. The class action payout helped us rebuild our lives, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without the crushing weight of anxiety. But just when I thought it was all over, I discovered something that turned everything I thought I knew on its head. It started with a phone call from Stephen, the accountant who'd helped expose Rick's financial crimes. I hadn't heard from him since the class action case wrapped up, so when his number popped up on my screen, I assumed he was calling to share some news about his new job or life post-scandal. But when I answered, his voice was panicked. "Liam, we need to talk. Now." "What's going on?" I asked, instantly on edge. "It's about the company," he said. "About Rick. There's something I didn't tell you, something I only just found out." Stephen refused to talk over the phone, insisting we meet in person. We agreed to meet at the same coffee shop where we'd had our first conversation months ago. When I walked in, Stephen was already there, hunched over a coffee cup that looked untouched. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. "What's this about?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Stephen leaned in, lowering his voice. "You remember those offshore accounts? The ones Rick was funneling money into?" I nodded. "Yeah, they're what got him nailed for tax fraud." "Why?" He hesitated, looking around the room like he was afraid someone might be listening. "I always assumed those accounts were just for his personal use. You know, hiding his dirty money. But recently, I got a tip from an old contact in the financial sector. Someone who's, let's just say, familiar with offshore banking. Liam, those accounts weren't just for Rick." "What do you mean?" Stephen exhaled slowly. "He was laundering money for someone else. A lot of someone else's, actually. I'm talking about people with serious power. Politicians, business tycoons, even a judge or two. Rick wasn't just embezzling money, he was part of a massive money laundering operation." My stomach dropped. "Wait, are you telling me?" "Yes," Stephen interrupted. "Rick wasn't the top of the pyramid. He was just a middleman. A cog in a much bigger machine. And the people he was working for? They're still out there. Untouchable." I sat back in my chair, trying to process what he was saying. It felt like the ground had just shifted beneath my feet. All this time, I thought Rick was the villain, the mastermind behind everything. But now I was learning he was just a pawn. Stephen continued. "When the investigations into Prime College started heating up, Rick tried to protect himself. He kept files, records of every transaction, every client he laundered money for. He planned to use them as leverage if anyone came after him." "Where are these files now?" I asked, my voice sharp. "That's the thing," Stephen said, his eyes darting nervously. "I think someone got to them. Those files should have been part of the evidence the IRS collected, but they've disappeared. Completely wiped. And here's the kicker, Rick's sentence. 25 years. That's light for the kind of crimes he committed. He should have been facing life in prison." I leaned forward. "You think someone pulled strings to make sure Rick stayed quiet?" Stephen nodded grimly. Exactly. They made sure he took the fall, but only enough to keep him in line. If he talks, he's dead, and he knows it. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I glanced around, half expecting someone in a dark suit to walk in and arrest us for even discussing this. Why are you telling me this? I asked. What am I supposed to do with this information? Stephen hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out a USB drive. Because I found something, he said, sliding it across the table to me. Before I quit, I managed to recover part of the file Rick kept. It's not everything, but it's enough to prove he wasn't acting alone. I need you to do something with it. I stared at the USB drive like it was a live grenade. Stephen, this is huge. If what you're saying is true, this could bring down some very dangerous people. Exactly, he said. And that's why I can't go public with it. I've got a family to think about. But you've already got the attention of the media. Carly, the class action lawsuit, you're in the perfect position to expose this. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to hand the drive back and walk away. I'd already fought my battle and won. Did I really want to dive back into this mess? But another part of me knew I couldn't ignore it. Not if what Stephen was saying was true. Not if there were still people out there exploiting the system and getting away with it. I took the drive. Over the next few days, I worked up the courage to open the files. What I found made my blood run cold. Stephen was right, Rick wasn't working alone. The records showed payments from high-ranking officials, prominent CEOs, and even a state senator. All of them funneled their dirty money through Rick's operation, using Prime Haulage as a front. It was a web of corruption that reached higher than I could have ever imagined. I called Carly immediately. I need to meet with you, I said. This is bigger than Rick. Way bigger. When I showed her the files, she was speechless. Liam, this could be the biggest story of my career. But you realize what you're getting into, right? These aren't the kind of people who take kindly to being exposed. I know, I said. But someone has to do it. Over the next few weeks, Carly worked tirelessly to verify the information in the files. She reached out to her contacts, cross-referenced the data, and even confronted one of the names listed in the records. As we got closer to publishing the story, strange things started happening. Carly's car was broken into. My emails were hacked. And one night, Emily and I came home to find our front door ajar, though nothing appeared to be stolen. It was clear someone was trying to scare us. But we didn't back down. Finally, the story went live, unmasking the power players, the secret money laundering operation behind Prime Haulage. It named names, exposed the network, and laid bare the corruption that had propped up Rick's empire. The fallout was immediate. Investigations were launched, resignations were announced, and at least one of the people named in the story fled the country. But with the victory came consequences. A few weeks after the story broke, I received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 words written on it: "You should have stayed out of it." I don't know who sent it, and I probably never will. But I keep it in my desk drawer as a reminder that some battles never truly end. Exposing Rick was just the beginning. The system that allowed him to thrive is still out there, bigger and more dangerous than I ever imagined. But if they think they can scare me into silence, they're wrong. I've already taken down one empire. Who's to say I can't do it again?